All right, well, let's put a few items on the screen here and we'll talk about snapping. And we did talk about the auto grid, is that correct, last time? I'll go over it again. Anyway, so if I wanted to stack the cylinder on top of the box, right, I could do that straight from the beginning. Oh, did I not record?
Oh, you might have.
I am recording, sorry, yeah. Okay, so, good, thanks for reminding me though. So if I wanted to put that cylinder on top of the box, I would have to, create the cylinder and then move it, right? However, with AutoGrid turned on, what it does is it recognizes where the cursor is. Let's make that bigger. So it recognizes where the cursor is, and if I put the cursor on an object, it recognizes the direction of the face or the polygon that the cursor is over, right? So if it's on the ground, it'll put the Z direction. If you notice can't make it smaller now. The Z-axis, the blue axis, is straight up and down, as would normally be the case in a world coordinate system. However, if I put the cursor against one of the sides of the box, the Z points in the direction of the side of the box, right? So that's what the AutoGrid does. It's pretty apparent on the cylinder, right? So if I put the cursor over it, notice how the Z-axis and the Y, well, the Y just rotates around, but the X-axis follows tangent to the cylinder, if you want to call it that. Does that make sense? So if I want to make another cylinder, I see how it's oriented in that direction of the face that I started drawing it. And likewise, so we get the idea.
And how did you enable that again?
Yeah, it's just a checkbox in the Create panel. So yeah, it can be kind of annoying, but it works really well. So that's another thing. So let's say I want to put this cylinder, just getting back to using the other tools, like the move tool. So W on the keyboard gives my move tool. And let's say I want to move this cylinder on top of the box, right? So I could use the align tool, but I can also use snaps. So all these, I have 4 different tools or snap tools that snap different things. The first one snaps positions, right, in 3D space. Although you do have 3 options here. One is in 2.5D space or just 2D space, which would keep it to the X and Y directions. 2.5 would keep it to the directions of the viewport, and 3 is just all 3 dimensions. So we'll leave it at 3. I can right-click on it to pull up the grid and snap settings, and those have the options where you can choose what gets snaps, right? So right now, grid points are the only option turned on, but let's say I go to vertex and leave it at that. Okay, I'll just leave this open. I'll put it over here. And so now I want to move the, yeah, let's go pivot point also.
How did you get the ground snap setting right?
Yeah, a right mouse button on that 3 magnet, right? That 3D magnet, and that pulls up the grid and snap settings. In fact, a right mouse button click on any of these tools, right, pulls up, there's your move transform, there's your rotate transform, there's your scale transform. I can skip these, and right click on the snaps pulls these snap tools up as well. Or does it? Oh, yeah, it's the same settings. So yeah, so for angles, right, I'm snapping to 5-degree increments. The percentage, there's a percent snap, so that's for scaling. You can that'll snap to 10% increments, and so forth, right? The snap radius, if you're within 20 pixels of one of the snapped items that you said you wanted to snap to, then it'll snap to it, right? So I'm going to turn on, what was I going to turn on? Pivot points, right? So I can see where the pivot point is here. So if I just click if I get my cursor close enough to the midpoint or the pivot point of the cylinder, I can just click and drag on it, right? And then I can just move it to like a grid point. So if I'm close enough to a grid point out here, I almost had it. Yeah, over here, there's a grid point. So now I've just snapped, I've just picked up that cylinder and see how it's, that pivot point is snapped to the ground there. Okay. Yeah. Let me right click on. So even though the AutoGrid set the orientation for this cylinder, I can reset that, or it can be reset in the angle settings, right? The angle transform. So I right clicked on the rotate tool, and I can just right click on the spinner there and set it back to 0. So now the cylinder is like oriented to the world again. The X, Y, and Z are oriented back to the 3ds Max's worlds, X, Y, and Z. See how that works? Okay, I'll get my move tool back, and I'm still not done because I want to move the center of that cylinder to the top of the box. Well, what could I use? So I'm going to turn off vertex. I'll keep pivot point on, but I'll turn off grid points, and maybe I want to go to face, or, well, midpoint of edge. That's not going to help. Center of face, that might work. Although there's 2 faces here. So maybe midpoint, I could get to the midpoint of, yeah, there's not really an edge there, so I can't do that. Center of face will get me as close as I can get. So I can pick it up from its pivot point and snap it to, I could have done a vertex, I guess, but midpoint of face. So there you go. Yep. Makes sense? Snaps are also useful for, remember how we could move and rotate stuff from their pivot point center, or from their midpoints, or from the average of all the selected items, or from the reference coordinate system, we could rotate things around each other. But what we can also do, so if I get the rotate tool, I'll just use this box as an example, and I'll turn off, well, I'll keep the snaps on. I'm going to set, with the rotate tool, I'm going to set the working, the coordinate system to working, right? And I still have these snap settings. I'm going to go back to vertex here. Just vertex now. So now, if I get my cursor close enough to one of the vertices of the box, I can click and drag, and it's rotating, or it's pivoting about the about the pivot point as would the reference would indicate. But if I change the reference to the coordinate system, and so now when I do the same thing, see how it's pivoting about the corner of the box? So now I can rotate about the vertices, right? So I can only move it, notice no matter what I do with my cursor, it's only rotating in the, Z plane, or in the XY plane, or about the Z axis, if you want to call it that. So one thing you can do is constrain it, right? So we haven't talked about constraints all that much, but a click on any of these on any of these 3 rings of the gizmo gives you a constraint about that gizmo. If you click in the middle, however, well, I'm still constrained though. Can I get out of that? See if I click. So that'll help me rotate about each yeah, why isn't that working? About both the X and Y. Maybe that will only let me go about one axis. That's strange. I always thought you could do both. Well, as far as constraints go, I can use the keyboard. The keyboard shortcuts for it are F5 through 8. So 5, 6, 7, and 8. So 5 is the x-axis. The F keys, the function keys. F6 is the y. F7 is the z. F8 toggles the xy planes, or the three different planes that you can, well, moving is a little easier to see. Okay, so if I hit F8, well, I'm still working on that, so let me turn off working. Oh, that's on view. Doesn't seem to be working. Let's turn off the snaps. There we go. Oh, so that makes sense. Before it wouldn't indicate that, so I'm just not used to this version, I guess. So with the snaps turned on, you can't change your move, and that makes sense, the move constraints, because the snaps override your axis constraints, as they're called, right? So right now, I can see let me make this a little bigger so we can see it. I can see the green axis, or the y-axis, is the constrained axis because it's yellow, right? You can see it highlighted in yellow. So I can click on each one of those, just a single click, and then I can go around and I can just grab this, and no matter what I do, it's only going to move in the z direction. Okay, so it's only the move tool that's constrained, not the object themselves, right? Okay, so back to the box. And so F5, x-axis. F6, right? F6 is y. F7 is z. And then F8 toggles between the xy, the yz, and the xz axes. So now when I click on something, it'll only move in the x and z axis, although that's kind of hard to see in the perspective viewport. But so those are axis constraints. They're extremely useful. So take advantage of those. Okay. All right. I think we've exhausted most of the intro kind of selecting. Oh, yeah, what we didn't talk about, I guess. Now that I have several objects here, oh, and I didn't tell you, making the gizmo bigger and smaller can be useful. Sometimes it gets in the way. I'm trying to click on something and the gizmo's in the way. So the plus and minus keys, you don't have to hit the shift plus next to the backspace key on the keyboard. So the minus key makes it smaller. The plus key, or the equals key, if you want to call it that, makes it bigger, up to a certain size. So you can adjust the size of the gizmo, and that's the plus and minus keys. Although on the keypad, it does not work, right? It has to be on the keyboard. So the plus and minus on the 10 key doesn't do that. So, okay. Good. I'm going to go back to the regular select tool, which is a Q on the keyboard. And toggling through that, so hitting Q, and I think I can't remember if we mentioned that or not, but I'll just reiterate. Toggling through that pulls up the different select tools. This is similar to Photoshop. You have the rectangular marquee, the oval marquee, although that's only circular, and the polygon marquee, and then the free lasso tool, if you want to call it that, right? It's analogous to the lasso tool. Oh, it is called the lasso tool, yes. And then the paint tool, right? So you can paint over something to select it. You can drag a window around something to not have to select. I missed it. There I got to not select something. So that's the lasso tool. The paint tool. The other ones are pretty easy to see, but they're really useful. So painting, you can just hit on something Not if. Doesn't seem to want to do it still. Yeah, that should be selecting it. I'm not sure why it's not now, but yeah, you should be able to just paint right over it and get it selected, but otherwise it just acts like the regular rectangular select tool. Okay, and we talked about what the window crossing tool does. Does anybody remember what that does? All right, so when it's on, right? So notice this will only select, actually, I don't know if I'm hitting it there. The object with the window turned on, then it has to be totally inside the window to select it. So I guess it was. Like that. Notice how it didn't select any of the cylinders, even though the cylinders were hitting it. But with it off, with the crossing, all it has to do is cross into that window, and it will select it. Do I have... in the preferences, though, you can override that with, and I do have that turned on, sorry. So it'll auto, and maybe that's why. Let me turn that off, and then, okay. So that will, let's go back to the paint tool. That will let you use this as a toggle. So once it's crossing, whatever it hits will get selected. And when it's on window, whatever's totally inside it will get selected. So in that case, those three, the two cylinders in the box. With the paint tool, I should be able to just paint over something. It's still not working. I don't know why. Oh, yeah, maybe it has to be. There we go. So with the paint tool, you can select something very easily just by clicking and dragging, sort of like the lasso tool, but all you got to do is hit it with that size radius. But with the customized preferences, with the auto window crossing by direction, right to left will cross and left to right will not. So in this case, I'll just go back to the regular rectangular marquee tool. So if I start on the right and go left, whatever hits it will get selected. If I start from the left and go right, it has to be totally inside it to select it. Does that make sense? So that can be useful. So I accidentally left that on. We'll go ahead and turn that off. So that can be pretty useful if you get used to it. Okay, good. Oh, H on the keyboard will pull up a select by list, right? So you can select something by its name. And then you can hold the control key down and select more than one thing. So I don't know what cylinder 1 and 3 are. I imagine I'll get those. So that's cylinder 1 and 3 right there. Is that good? You can also hide or freeze whatever you have selected. So a right mouse button click is useful to hide your selection, or you can freeze the selection. So with that, no matter what you do, it's not going to select it. It's not going to accidentally delete it or move it or something. So if you have something just in the right position, maybe you want to freeze it. So, and they'll show up in gray. And you can unfreeze all. And you can just freeze a certain item if you go to its object properties and freeze, and then uncheck show frozen in gray. So if you know what object it is, and maybe I'll name this Tower 1 or something, so I know that it's has a different item. So now I won't be able to select it, but it's not gray if you need that, right? So I would have to unfreeze all again and then select that and go back to its properties. So that's how you get back into the properties. Also, you can use your layer settings. So we'll talk about layers and stuff later also, but not right now. Okay. I think that's all I want to say. Yeah. So we'll continue working on our